The Identity Parade by Johny Pitts. In a milieu of modest aspirations, I'd found the dream job. It seemed to emerge from the same 90s working class wonderland as the invitation to my mum to participate in market research, where she'd spend an evening with her friends trying out new chocolate bars or face creams to fill out a questionnaire and receive £50. Between the ages of 14 and 18, my side hustle involved spending one day every other week or so at the West Bar police station in Sheffield, lining up for an identity parade when somebody else deemed black other or mixed race was suspected of committing a crime. A bunch of maybe 30 young men with light brown skin would converge in a small, clinical room to be inspected by an officer and get whittled down to 20, those sent home receiving a £10 show fee. For us lucky few chosen to stay on, an extra £5 an hour would be given, and then would be sent in to get scrutinised by the actual suspect, who would choose which 10 of us he felt most resembled his image for the final lineup. Surrounded by our peers, the only emotion we showed during those ID parades was macho bravado, but the process involved could sometimes be hair-raising. I remember one young man in particular, maybe a year older than I was, still a teenager, who was suspected of multiple gangland murders. He wandered along the line staring each of us in the eye, nose to nose, with a menacing look that, just like ours, must have masked an inner terror. He was facing life behind bars at that young age. It's terrifying to think that if he was found guilty back then, 20 years ago, he might still be essentially where I left him, in prison, during which time I've met my lifelong partner, had a child, travelled the world, written a couple of books and moved to Marseille. Had a life and the chance to reconfigure how I identify myself as a man and somebody with brown skin. Other than the tense line-up selection and the deeply unsettling experience of sometimes being misidentified as the perpetrator of the crime, we were assured by police that we had total immunity. These events were something that at the time I would have described as fun, maybe even funny. It was a convivial space with a strange power dynamic. While we all chatted among ourselves, we were at best standoffish with the officers, at worst exceptionally rude to them, almost encouraged to relish this rare, safe, familiar proximity to law enforcement we didn't have out on the streets. Officers were always middle-aged white men, and whatever we threw their way, they remained chipper, in that patronising way people with all the power can be, and bent over backwards to make us feel comfortable. And as well they might. I had no idea at the time that shortly before this new casual employment of mine, the South Yorkshire Police had made the national press for blacking up the faces of 8 white men to appear in an identity parade with a black suspect, a fact which resulted in the case being thrown out of court because of unfair process. Police at the time claimed they couldn't get enough people together who resembled the suspect. They obviously found it easier to find black criminals than law-abiding members of the black community. I was part of a weird sort of outreach scheme then, the police connecting with us in order to help the process of imprisoning people who looked like us. Yet they also connected us with each other, and in those days a kind of fleeting community was cultivated around this notion of mixed race as constructed by the police. We'd never talk of it or express it in any way that would hint at a special bond, but in a way the beauty of the connection lay in the lack of expression. There, in some random room in a police building, we had what might now be called a safe space for a group of people on the front line of managing multiple cultures, where, beyond the usual teenage posturing, we didn't have to perform a racialised identity. I remember lying to black friends about getting beats from my parents because they would always talk about it with such pride, as though it made them tougher and wiser. And yet, in the police station, our mixed raceness itself was turned into a performance. Our identity was literally a parade. I often brag that if I don't know someone who is mixed race, from Sheffield and in their 30s, then I definitely know someone who knows them. And my confidence stems from those years hunched up with so many other mixed race kids in the West Bar police station. But in this era of spurious social media platforms, I look back and think, if these ID parades acquainted me with an entire generation of mixed-race Sheffielders, then they obviously did the same for the police, giving them names, siblings, addresses, and perhaps even valuable clues about what was happening in our communities. In the way my mum's market research gig drew out private information, cultural trends and demographic tendencies from her and her friends in order to empower a large, powerful system at play, so too did these ID parades give the South Yorkshire Police intimate access to young mixed-race men. Like the safe spaces we see with WhatsApp groups, they also cordoned us off into a monolithic cultural entity. Over the 3 or 4 years I did the parades, an odd thing began to occur. Faces from our pool of paid volunteers started appearing as the actual suspects. Lads we'd walked in with only a couple of weeks earlier now greeting us from the other side of the fence, totally humiliated in front of their own community, with the crimes they'd been accused of laid bare. A police officer would read out the allegation from behind the one-way mirror to sniggers from us volunteers. Adolescence is a rocky road for everyone, but during that hormonal battleground marked by the ID parades, I saw so many of these kids go by the wayside, end up in jail or dead. Very often, the only brown faces I'd ever see on the front page of the local Sheffield Star newspaper were accompanied by headlines like "Monster" and "Sicko" above or below them. This experience partly played into my decision to train as a youth worker. I ended up getting a job with a mentorship scheme set up by Sheffield City Council called the Multiple Heritage Service, the first of its kind in Europe and a totally new Labour type of project, one that looked great on paper but was flimsy in practice, and attempted to institutionalise the messy lived experience of people of multiple heritage. On the one hand, the development of the service appeared to suggest Britain's multicultural reality was finally being recognised. On the other, the service defined itself by highlighting how multiculturalism was failing, drawing upon small-scale empirical research that drew basic conclusions from complicated issues. Mixed-race people, we were told, were underachieving at school, suffered disproportionately from social exclusion, were the fastest growing group of young offenders, up to 8 times more likely than children in white, Afro-Caribbean or Asian families to enter care, and had a higher likelihood of family breakdown. The problem with this research is that it overwhelmingly used the terms multiple heritage or mixed race to describe people with a black and a white parent. When academic underachievement was mentioned, it didn't refer to kids who had a Scottish mum and an Irish father, for example, or a Danish dad and a Japanese mother. To be clear, some of these issues were real for the mixed race community. I suffered from a couple of them personally, but weren't presented as part of a problem endemic to British society at large. This problem had multiple facets. Racism, both casual and institutional, the failure of schools to teach the impacts of colonialism properly, the lack of resources and amenities in working-class neighbourhoods, which were also often the most multicultural because of the communities who came to Britain to help rebuild the country after World War II. Yemenis, Jamaicans and Pakistanis were in Britain partly to fill in for the post-war shortage of cheap labour. In 2001, for the first time, the national census included a box where a person could identify themselves as being of a mixed ethnicity. Less than a year later, however, in 2002, the year the Multiple Heritage Service was set up, David Blunkett, who was then Home Secretary and MP for Sheffield's Brightside, the constituency in which I was born and raised, went on record as saying British schools were being swamped by asylum seekers. This was one of many occasions in which the new Labour government co-opted and even championed multiculturalism on the one hand, while they undermined it on the other. For my part, I entered schools as a youth worker charged with the goal of raising self-esteem. This involved delivering bland facts about historical figures from Jamaica, Ghana or the United States. It was supposed to serve as a corrective to the national curriculum in which blackness was largely absent. But all it did was induce the same vacant stares I remember seeing and giving when I'd been at school. Any blackness in academia was presented as over there and back then, detached from the world in front of us. In the end, we would spend the sessions talking about football or hip-hop, which sometimes morphed into freestyle sessions, which might, on a good day, then tenuously lead us to Walter Rodney, Kwame Nkrumah or Martin Luther King. Invoking the reason Talib Kweli once rapped, "I speak at schools a lot because they say I'm intelligent. No, it's because I'm dope. If I was whack, I'd be irrelevant." Sometimes, using this more relaxed method, I would break down barriers with the kids I mentored. But unlike my teenage years doing the ID parades, I began to feel uneasy about getting a paycheck for work that I ultimately felt was most often inane and ineffective. The staff at the Multiple Heritage Service were well-meaning, but totally indoctrinated into the managerial spiel of New Labour. Instead of helping out in the community, they were knee-deep in bureaucracy, investing in people rather than nurturing talent, and filling out forms for subsidies in the cultural industries. "There's no one so easy to rob of their culture as those who don't know that they've got one," once said the Liverpudlian sculptor Arthur Dooley. And I realised that the reductive realm of officialdom I'd experienced seemed to have a way of crushing everything it supposedly championed. The commodification of multiculturalism meant that while diversity, and especially the image of mixed-race people, could be seen on billboards for brands like H&M and the United Colours of Benetton in the noughties, or attached to globalisation and found in elite non-places, to quote Marc Augier, corporate, internationally neutral spaces such as hotel lobbies, airport lounges and boardrooms where commerce suiting a global elite took place. It was detached from working class streets that often lived a multicultural reality. This is an issue now more than ever, as communities are grouped into demographic silos by social media companies who enforce convenient though reductive identities through algorithms and advertising. For me, terms like multiple heritage and mixed race, or Afropean, a term I use as a connective portal into a wider lived experience in the wake of European colonialism, if we're to continue to use them, need to be reimagined in the realms of the everyday again, not in the institutions where one could so often find them in the 90s and noughties. I look at the landscape of my childhood and see that spaces where mixedness so often took place, drum and bass raves, high-rise estates that served as broadcasting towers for pirate radio stations, which operated as canvases for a legendary graffiti scene, barbershops, illegal blues parties and spontaneous get-togethers, the type that resulted in a legendary street carnival in the Caribbean area of Pittsmore, were vanquished by Sheffield City Council and then replaced with sanitised versions. Instead of messy, organic places of social encounter, the type that allowed movements such as the 1920s Harlem Renaissance to thrive, this new type of multiculturalism and its politics of space had its goals driven by corporate or government subsidies and reduced to the type of forced expressions of togetherness that spelled its death. If the mixed race experience can mean anything, it can't be policed, put in a room or on a billboard. It needs to be fluid and borderless, a practical, lived entry into a shifting and blurry experience that reminds us that those things are exactly what it is to be human. Whatever your roots, whatever your roots.